Before I get into the interview for this week, I wanted to thank this week's episode sponsor, Bark Technologies. I am honestly so grateful that parents today have safer device options for our kids. The Bark phone was built for families who are looking to ramp up their child's online safety. It has parental controls built in and allows us to manage screen time and their entire digital experience super easily. Now on to my interview with pediatrician and researcher, Dr. John Hutton. Welcome to Scrolling to Death. Today I am joined by pediatrician, clinical researcher, and author, Dr. John Hutton. Welcome, Dr. Hutton.
Thank you, Nikki. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to chat with you about lots of things, but I want to start with sharing you've published 29 children's books. Do I have the number right?
Actually, I have over 40 now, so that's a that's an
40?
that's an
Where did I
old
get that
bio.
number?
Somewhere on it's like internet lore.
Yeah. Okay. So, and many have themes relevant to this audience. So, this podcast is for parents who are worried about social media and screen time. So, a lot of your books are about screen time reduction, play-based childhood, and really the importance, stressing the importance of reading real books. And so, we're going to talk about the importance of that today. You also owned Blue Manatee Children's Bookstore for almost 20 years.
Correct. That was a
Amazing.
wonderful little independent store. So
Yeah. Okay. In Texas, where you live.
that was when I lived in Cincinnati. So I actually just
Okay.
just moved to Texas this past summer, and
Wow.
yeah, but I was in Cincinnati for quite a few years before that.
Okay. Where did your passion for reading and writing come from?
So, I mean, it goes back to just how I grew up as a kid. I mean, I was fortunate that both my parents, they didn't have a lot of money growing up. They were scholarship kids, but they all, when they raised us, my sisters and I mean, we always went to the library and there were always books at home. They were both readers. And
Mm-hmm.
my mom read to me, I remember all the time when I was little. I mean, I preferred to go outside and play in the dirt, which is part of my attraction to screen-free childhood. But when it was
Mm-hmm.
raining or there was nothing else to do, we would read together. And then when I had my own kids, we have three daughters. One of the things that I really did as a dad was I read with them pretty much every day from when they were
Mm-hmm.
infants until they wouldn't let me anymore when they were, about 10 or 11 years old and they could read better than I could. And they're like, Dad, it's time to move. It's time to move forward.
Yeah.
So, so that's, sort of my own personal interest in reading, but then also having run a children's bookstore for a period of time and then working in my clinical practice, which is in clinics that primarily serve Medicaid eligible families. I really saw firsthand the disparities in access to not only children's books, but in readers and just that sort of,
Mm.
the sort of nurturing reading routines. And so I became very engaged with wanting to make a difference in terms of providing better access to resources for kids that don't have as much opportunity.
Yeah. Amazing. Nowadays, everything is going virtual. So kids are using iPads to read at home, or they're using devices to read and learn at school, which I want to talk about schools with you a little bit later. But why do you feel it's so important for our children to interact with real books rather than virtual books?
Yeah, and there's both science behind that and sort of poetry behind that. I think what a child gets out of reading changes with age. I mean, starting prenatally and then when babies are infants, it's more about the bonding, the sort of relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about books is that they only do one thing. They let you read them, and there's no buttons, there's no other apps hiding behind them. I mean, you open it, and then the reader has to sort of bring their own imagination and language and experiences into play. And as kids get older, they start to be able to participate and read the words and use and ask questions. And I think it's just a nice finite experience between a parent or other caregiver and a child where it's really just about them and the book. It's that really
Mm-hmm.
shared experience. And as kids get older, I think it's similar where when they're sitting and reading a book, they're reading a book. They're not sort of reading a book on their tablet, which they then can toggle into video games or emails and getting distracted by text or whatever. Because
Mm-hmm.
because the other thing about, I mean, reading on a tablet or a device is not, there's nothing really inherently wrong with it, but the problem is that kids tend to be distracted by the device and they know that there's other stuff in there and a lot of the attention in the reading experience is focused on the
Mm-hmm.
device, not so much on the story. So that's why I'm a fan
Okay.
of good old-fashioned books.
Yeah. And aside from the distractions, I've heard things like you actually absorb more from paper, something with the haptics, than you do from virtual books. Do you know anything about that?
I think it's most likely related to just focus and attention.
Okay.
Just I mean
Okay.
that I have read things about the brightness of the screen and sort of different aspects, but I tend to think it's mostly about just immersing yourself in the story and
Hmm.
devices. There's always that sense that there's something else there behind the scenes, and you're much more likely to be distracted. And the minute you toggle into something else, as those of us that have been reading something and then check their email, it just takes a while to kind of get back focused on the story. So.
Yeah. I've heard something like in the classroom, if a kid checks their phone, then they look back up, it can take up to 20 minutes for them to fully refocus on what they're learning in class.
Yeah, I've heard it described as a cognitive tax. It's sort of like,
Uh-huh.
there's this myth that people are good multitaskers. They can do multiple things at the same time, but that's
Hmm.
really not true. It's more that the brain shifts between tasks, and there's actually
Hmm.
a network in the brain called the ventral attention network, whose job it is
Hmm.
to sort of shift the spotlight. And it's the network in our brain that evolved to protect us from getting eaten by bears, where we're really focused on the campfire, but then we hear rustling in the bushes and we turn over and we decide to shift our attention to what's in the bushes rather than the campfire.
Hmm.
Um, but when we're on a device and we're being distracted, that same network comes into play to reorient our attention. But it does take a bit of time to get focused back on what we were doing in the first place.
Yeah. I interviewed, I don't know if you know Dr. Gloria Mark. She's at UC Irvine, I believe, and she has a book called Attention Span.
Yeah,
And it was fascinating. And that really the myth of multitasking, that people think they can do a lot of things at once. But when they do that, they're doing everything worse. They're taking longer, making more errors. And
yeah,
it's just fascinating to learn that we really went from a time where, oh, being a multitasker was like a good thing you wanted to be, where
right.
now it's like you really have to separate tasks. We understand that how that affects the brain, I think, more.
And it's exhausting.
Yeah,
And we keep inventing devices that do more and more stuff. And
right.
it's not just, reading and checking your email. Now we're also got, 10 different social media platforms that are getting our attention and pop-ups. And
Hmm.
I've heard teachers talk about English teachers reading kids' essays in elementary school and or middle
Hmm.
school, and they say I can tell which kids had their phone next to them when they were writing this paper because it's sort of like
Hmm.
they're on a certain topic and then it just drifts or they kind of drop
Hmm.
it and there's just this sort of all over the place nature to the writing um,
Hmm.
rather than just taking an idea and following it in a really focused way.
Right. And if we can imagine how that plays out in the future, I mean, these are our future doctors and lawyers and all these things that we need in society that can't focus because they're not their fault. They're so distracted by everything going on around them, all the electronics. But let's talk about screen time overall. And I know the latest stat shows that American children are getting over 7 hours of screen time per day. Let's talk about developing brains. How is this affecting the developing brains of our children, all of this screen time?
I think that the unfortunate short answer is we don't really know yet. I think
Hmm.
I just came back from a summit at National Institutes of Health about a month ago, where they brought together
Hmm.
researchers from all over the country and all over the world to talk about a research agenda for what should we be studying and at what age. And
Hmm.
the big focuses were on a lot of mental health disorders in adolescents and then young children. And one of the issues with young kids, which is really my focus there of my research, is that human brains have evolved over millennia to be really good at certain things. And they're
Hmm.
analog organs. So they're good at processing our five senses and interacting with other people and kind of navigating risk out in the real world. And what technology does is it simulates those experiences on a screen, and it essentially collapses the five senses into two, audio, visual. And
Hmm.
for the most part, kids can get by okay with that. But I think in terms of optimal development, it's probably the case that in order for the brain to really develop in a way that's again, optimal is by
Hmm.
having those multisensorial real world experiences that are sort of open ended, where a
Hmm.
child can, go outside and explore the backyard, and they can hear the sounds of birds, and they can feel the breeze on their face, and they can look up at their
Hmm.
caregivers, and I think there's a lot to that that probably really has a big impact on not only how the brain develops, but on subsequent mental health and um, all kinds of different domains that we're really just beginning to understand. And I think one area that I really worry about the most is social skills and social cognition, where a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the experiences in early childhood are being channeled onto devices. And there's some evidence that some of the rise in, and it's controversial, but in some of the autism spectrum disorders, and there's sort of autism-like
Mm-hmm.
presentations of kids that just don't, they're just socially awkward and socially anxious, and they just aren't given enough practice when they're little to interact with other people. And some of
Mm.
our research has shown some differences in the brain related to that, even at preschool age.
Wow. What about physically with the brain? Is it looking different? I've seen things, is it the gray matter is diminished or something with a lot of screen time? Is that right?
So we published a couple studies in the past few years in preschool age kids, and these are the only studies that I'm aware of in the world that have looked at that age
Mm.
related to, and we used a measure called the screen Q that we developed.
Okay.
It's a 15 item composite measure. It's not just one question, how much screen time do you use a day, or where do you use it, which is what a lot of the research is based on. It essentially reflects the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines, looking at screen time in four domains. It looks at
Mm-hmm.
access to screens. Is there a screen in the bedroom? Does the child have access at meals? Things like that. Frequency of use, hours per day, how old the child was when they started.
Mm-hmm.
Content, like fast moving, slow moving, violent, not violent, and then
Yeah.
co-viewing. So there's four main domains that are all featured in the guidelines. And
Mm-hmm.
essentially, the screen Q, the higher the score, the more non-adherent to the guidelines that the child was, or the family was. And
Mm-hmm.
so what we found is that kids with higher screen Q scores at age 3 to 5 had, the first study we published, had different, significant differences in their white matter development, sort of the
White
wiring of the
matter.
brain,
Yeah.
connecting all different parts of the brain. But we specifically looked at areas that were involved with language and literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And we found significantly lower measures of white matter, and it's probably reflects what's called myelination, which is sort of the coding of the white matter that makes it faster and more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And we also found significantly lower skills in language, literacy, and executive function.
Mm-hmm.
And that study got a whole bunch of attention. It was all over the place. Like I got like
Mm-hmm.
85 interview requests in 3 days because it was the first one that had come out to say that there are significant differences in that aspect of brain development at that age.
Mm-hmm.
The second study we published looked at gray matter, which is the sort of the surface of the brain where the cells are. And we found that kids, again, with higher screen Q scores or higher measures of digital media use had significantly thinner cortex in a couple of different parts of their brain, one in visual areas that, and cortical thickness is a little more complicated because the brain thins naturally with development,
Mm.
but
Okay.
it thins at different rates and for different reasons.
Got it.
So in some measures, it's a measure of efficiency. So that the thinning in the visual areas was interpreted as just kids had more exposure to screens and they actually had increased efficiency of their visual networks to watch things. And,
Mm-hmm.
and that actually lines up with a study in adolescents. It's called the ABCD study. It's a huge
Mm-hmm.
study that's going on that found the same thing. But the
Mm-hmm.
other area where we found thinner cortex was in parts of the brain in the parietal lobe that are related to social cognition. It's called mirror neuron system, where it helps kids imagine sort of what another person is doing, and to sort of interpret um, emotions, facial expressions, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was sort of an indicator that there also are differences in gray matter development at that age related to higher screen use. So my interpretation as a pediatrician is that it's not the definitive study. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I think
Mm-hmm.
we really should be cautious because that is the age when the brain is growing most rapidly. It's very plastic. It's very responsive to experiences and really needs those real world experiences to develop optimally.
Right. With these changes in the brain due to a lot of screen time, how will these kids struggle in the future? Like, can we forecast that?
Yeah, I think ultimately we're going to bump up against some evolutionary constraints where we're letting kids use screens at younger and younger ages, and we're sort of short-circuiting a lot of really fundamental experiences. Connection with caregivers is a huge one in babies and younger kids.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Expressive language, because screens are great at talking to the child, but they're not so great at
Mm-hmm.
encouraging a child to talk. So
Right.
differences in language development,
Mm-hmm.
creativity, where a lot of the activities are more closed-ended, video games where only a certain thing happens. And some are
Mm-hmm.
more all over the place. But I think we're going to just be, again, like short-circuiting a lot of these experiences that the brain evolved to really need. And so my forecast is a lot of it's going to be social, and you see that in teenagers now, where we have higher rates of anxiety, higher rates
Mm-hmm.
of just kids feeling socially awkward and being more
Mm-hmm.
isolated. You see, I've heard it described as the quiet birthday party phenomenon, where you get a bunch of kids that go to a party and they're all on their phones because they're so nervous they don't know what to do when it gets quiet. It sort of creates this sort of slippery slope towards just using more and more media because we're comfortable using more and more media.
Yeah.
And I don't know. To me, it definitely worries me.
Yeah. Are any other physical effects you're seeing? Eyesight, um, curvature of the neck, on their sleep and
Yeah,
their physical health?
you named all the great ones. I mean, there's definitely a lot of evidence of increased rates of myopia, just nearsightedness with more screen time,
Mm-hmm.
just related to not so much focus on the screen, but and this is a really another of those sort of evolutionary things. The human visual system evolved to process different depths and different types
Mm-hmm.
of landscapes, and so
Mm-hmm.
um, kids that are focused on a certain depth, like between their face and the screen, their eyeball
Mm-hmm.
shape just becomes more. It affects the shape of their eyeball
Wow.
and their cornea. Whereas when you're outside, and that's why you're supposed to take breaks when you're on your screen and look out the window or something,
Yeah,
just to
I
keep
just
your
did
eyes.
that.
Yeah, that's protective. So that's the kind of
Right.
thing where just kids need a break to go outside and look at the sky and just let their eyes relax and so they don't get forced into that one way of
Mm-hmm.
looking at things. Sleep is huge. Sleep is increasingly recognized as really being a major risk factor for about everything, good or bad, depending on if you're sleeping well or not.
Mm-hmm.
Kids that don't sleep well tend to be overweight. They have a lot more difficulties in school, a lot more anxiety, a lot more behavior problems. And so that's why I think screens in the bedroom are one of the biggest things. If a parent was going to do something to help their child use less screen time, it's getting screens out of the bedroom, because that's where they tend to be used in an unrestricted way with all,
Mm-hmm.
whatever content, inappropriate or not. They wake kids
Yep.
up in the middle of the night. They use them too late. There's that
Mm-hmm.
sort of question of melatonin effect, where looking at the bright screen can sort of make it harder to fall asleep, although that's
Mm-hmm.
become controversial.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, so that's a couple of big ones. One thing I hear from parents is there's a lot of sort of desperation on the part of a lot of parents, like, what can I do? And when kids come in for their checkups, it's like, the child's on their phone through the whole visit, and the parent
Yep.
looks at them and says, pay attention to the doctor, and the child won't give the phone away, and then they cry, or they get
Mm-hmm.
fussy, and there's just a sense that parents just aren't sure what to do to, how can they do anything about it? They feel almost like it's inevitable the child's going to be on their device all the time.
Yeah. Can we just say, don't give them the device?
So one of my maxims, so the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations used to be no screens until age 2, or really discourage them,
Mm-hmm.
and then it shifted to 18 months, largely
Mm.
not so much because the evidence was any different related to the risks of using at young ages, but more they thought it was unrealistic, and that and they allowed video chat as one of the things that was okay, and it probably is okay.
Yeah.
Um, but it sort of, I think, opened the door for younger and younger use. And I just published a study recently where we found that about 60% of parents of infants under 4 months of age had access to screens. It's just
Oh.
early ages, and that's for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, there's just that sense of inevitability. One really important factor in which is the notion of differential susceptibility. I don't know if
Okay.
you've ever heard of that term, but
Mm-mm.
it started with some researchers out of the Netherlands, and it's the sense that we've done a whole bunch of research around screen time or media use, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the impacts have been found to be small to moderate, like a small risk of overweight, language delay,
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, and small to moderate. But that's on these big population level studies, looking at
Right.
all kids across the board. But probably
Mm-hmm.
what's closer to the truth is that you get a room full of 100 kids, and you have them, and you'll see like 20% of kids that are using it correctly, getting something out of
Mm-hmm.
it. They're texting their friends and looking up stuff for their homework and turning it off at night, and everything's fine. And you get like 60% of kids where it's kind of a little bit of both. They're a little distracted, they're homework's not as good as it could be, whatever, but for the most
Mm-hmm.
part, they're getting by. and then 20% of kids that are just really struggling. And these are the kids
Mm-hmm.
that are addicted to their devices. They won't come out of their room. They are overweight. They never exercise. They can't sleep. They get anxiety, feel suicidal. So we need to do a better job of identifying which kids are at highest risk of having those really negative effects,
Yep.
which begs the question, is 20% of kids at risk, is that um, is that worth doing more broad restrictions of device use for all kids? I mean, we have, 20% risk of cancer would be a lot, and we would probably ban
Mm.
that product.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Well, what do you think about the rise in suicide rates for adolescents? Do you feel like there's a link to media use?
100%. And I mean, I think that's unequivocally true. And that
Mm-hmm.
I think that really speaks to that same differential susceptibility question, where a lot of kids who are predisposed to be more anxious, you get them on
Mm-hmm.
Instagram and they're seeing all their friends and beautiful pictures and everybody's having fun, and
Yeah.
everybody's got more friends than they do, and they feel terrible and you can't turn it
Right.
off. I mean, back in, not so long ago, kids have always been anxious and depressed, but let's say they're getting picked on at school, which is terrible, but then they come home and they're not being picked on, at least while they're at home. Whereas
Right.
now, if they're being bullied on their phones, it never stops unless they throw the
Right.
phone away. So I absolutely think that's a huge, huge issue, and it's something that we really need to do something about, because there's just unrestricted access to so many platforms that kids are on now.
Yeah. And the algorithms push them toward more harmful content and content that keeps them in sort of a depressed state because that keeps their eyeballs on the screen for longer, is what we're learning. But I think that's really interesting with the differential susceptibility. For example, my two older kids who are now 6 and 8, I was letting them have a little bit of screen time each day, maybe 2 years ago. And my daughter was fine, take it or leave it, wouldn't talk about it afterward. My son, all he would talk about is this game he would play. He would try to sneak it. He was
Right.
lying about it. And so he has that thing. What is that thing? Is it a genetic thing? Is it a brain difference? Like, what is it?
It probably, I think it's all those things. I mean, the games and social media and everything are really, really powerful engines of triggering neurochemicals in our brain, particularly the
Mm-hmm.
dopamine system, which is the one that gives us rewards, like do something, feel good about it, do something, feel good about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of gets us hooked. And that I think there are several what are called phenotypes of risk. Kids that are at risk for specific things that you see related to screen time. So there's kids that are more inattentive by nature, where using
Mm-hmm.
devices can make them more inattentive, or they focus on the device, but then when they're trying to focus on the world, they really struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Probably doesn't cause ADHD, but it kind of creates that sort of ADHD-like symptomatology.
Right.
There are kids that are
Mm-hmm.
more risk-taking by nature, so and then they get them on the devices, and they're going to take more risks and put more inappropriate, look up more porn or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the kids that are more anxious or depressed, and you see
Mm-hmm.
more of the risks of anxiety, depression, and um, yeah, and so these are sort of a lot of the sort of the broad categories of the types of things that kids can run into.
Right. I'm pausing here to talk to you guys about tools that you can employ to help manage your children's screen time. And that is the Bark phone and the Bark app. Bark goes beyond device mirroring and uses advanced AI to scan texts and social media and images and videos and audio for threats like drug content, cyberbullying, and even child sexual abuse material. The effects of screen time and smartphones can be worrisome, but tools like Bark can give you peace of mind. The Bark phone is the most customizable kids phone with text and social media monitoring built in. It's the safest option. But if you are going with an Android or an iPhone, please consider layering on the Bark app, which is high-tech parental monitoring. It scans their activities for harmful content. It allows you to easily create screen time schedules, block certain websites and apps, and a ton more. Back to my conversation with Dr. Hutton. And do you feel like the addictive platforms that they're accessing, do you feel like that could lead to more addictive behaviors as they get older? Like, can you train addiction in children over time and then they apply it to other things?
That's a good question, and whether it crosses over between
Right.
drugs and video games. But I mean,
Yeah.
video game addiction is probably the best studied. I mean, that's a big problem in Asia. It's a big problem, in the States,
Mm-hmm.
because the video games, that they trigger that same dopamine release that a lot of drugs trigger. And
Right.
interestingly, one of the treatments for ADHD is it's dopamine related drugs, Ritalin
Mm-hmm.
and Adderall. that's the same
Mm-hmm.
thing that is triggered when kids play video games, because you'll hear from parents whose kids have ADHD, like, my child's so focused on their video game, and then they get off it and they're all over the place. That's because that's giving them that hit of dopamine. So,
Mm-hmm.
but as far as crossing over into risks for other drugs and alcohol, it's probably more seeing inappropriate content when they're
Okay.
online, like seeing other kids drinking or smoking or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
and having access to buy stuff, like buying
Mm-hmm.
vapes and other things online where they can, it's just easier to access stuff. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but and then and that is the other phenotype that we worry about, is kids that are more addictive by nature, that come from sort of hardwired to be at risk for being addicted to stuff, are more likely to be addicted to their devices. Oh, and
Right.
one other is eating disorders. That's another one not to be forgotten. I
Mm.
mean, I think that's another huge,
Mm-hmm.
risk of, a lot of social media.
Yeah, I just released an interview with Ava Smithing, who's just graduated college, but she's already doing a lot of legislative work. And she struggled with an eating disorder. She says social media taught me how to not eat, how to hide it from my family, and how to stay in it. And so you would be surprised at the types of content. I think a lot of parents wouldn't imagine that the type of content that is being served to our kids, like
Yeah,
how to die by suicide without feeling any pain. Literally, I've seen a video of that.
for sure.
It's
You don't even have to look for it anymore. I mean, now on
hmm
TikTok or whatever, you get these suggested videos that just flow through. You don't have to look on
hmm
Google. I want to look up
yeah,
eating disorders. All of a sudden, something pops onto
right,
your feed, and then if you click it, it feeds you more of it, and it kind of perpetuates that cycle.
right. Okay. So, do devices in childhood hold any educational value? Is there any reason why our children need to have device time as children?
Well, and that's a great question too. One of the pushbacks that you'll hear, so one of my maxims as a pediatrician is screen free until 3. Like,
Okay.
even though the AAP says 18 months, I think if a parent can keep their child off of devices in the first 3 years of their life before they really know what
hmm
they're missing. I mean, they might see their
Yeah.
parents on the devices, whatever, but they're not in school yet. They're not seeing other kids with devices. They're just kind of in their own, under 3-year-old, world.
Yeah.
That's when they're going to be anchored to those real. I mean, some of the main developmental challenges at that age are just fundamental connection with caregivers, language,
hmm
experiencing the real world, getting their hands dirty, and just kind of learning what the real world is like. And then
hmm
after that, then start using it in a more measured way. In a perfect world, I would take screens away from kids going through puberty too, because that's when the brain is being wired to feel like you fit in. You're just like,
hmm
and you start to compare yourself to others. And I think that's when kids start feeling really different and really awkward. Some feel great, but like that's when a lot
hmm
of the risks of a lot of those social media related things happen.
Yeah.
But back to your question about education, we definitely know that is a huge driver of use of media at a young age. Just the
hmm
term educational, which is put on so many apps for kids.
hmm
If you go into the app store and look up educational videos for toddlers, you'll probably get like 100,000 of them. And the problem with that is there's no legislation or standard where any of the app developers or video game makers have to show that their stuff is educational. There's no requirement.
Right.
We'd
Right.
have to prove it's not educational, which happened in the Baby Einstein case, famously
hmm
a while ago, where they had to pull some
Yep.
stuff off the market, and the Your
Yep.
Baby Can Read videos were the other ones. So anyway, so the term educational is sort of like natural food is out there,
hmm
and parents want the best for their kids. They want their kids to watch things that are going to be educational, make them smarter, make them succeed. Especially,
Sure.
families with less educational background themselves, where they feel like the devices are going to teach their kid better than they will.
hmm
And so that's a huge driver of just overall use. There is some good content out there that's created with sort of developmental standards in mind, like the Sesame Workshop stuff, and a lot of the PBS Kids, is more
hmm
mindfully created. YouTube Kids, by contrast, doesn't have any sort of advisory board or anything. It's just marketing. It's
No.
just says YouTube
Right.
Kids. But parents think, oh, it's
hmm
kids. It must be good for them.
hmm Yeah.
But as far as educational value, I think in some contexts for kids, and again for younger kids who are trying to memorize something, like
hmm
learn their alphabet or learn their numbers or something, hearing it repeated, it might be something where they can learn that way. But things where they have to sort of use their own creativity and focus and more open-ended things, writing an essay, whatever, um, probably less so.
Yeah, and most of this content is created with those quick clips, like 4-second cuts. And so we're training them to have this really short attention span from being small,
Huge.
right?
That's a
Yeah.
huge issue. And you see that in children's books too, unfortunately, where just the amount of content that a parent-child will stand for has gotten smaller and smaller, except for
Hmm.
Harry Potter and older kids. But
Yeah.
but anyway, the attention span is an enormous issue, just the ability to focus on a task for a long period of time. One of
Hmm.
the pushbacks on taking devices away at a young age, that you'll hear
Hmm.
from parents is, well, I don't want my kids to fall behind. I don't want them to not know how to use these devices, but they're really easy to use increasingly.
Right.
And
Right.
and if you think about it, like the people that invented this stuff, like Steve Jobs and the people that invented Google and everything, didn't have a lot of computers when they were little, and the ones they had were really clunky and didn't, were hard to use. But they
Yeah.
invented all this stuff that's now really easy to use. I mean, you don't really need technology to be technologically savvy down the road or to be
Right.
creative or anything like that.
And we don't know what, I mean, there's going to be something brand new by the time our littler kids are old enough to need to use it for their job or for college or something like that. And you bring up Steve Jobs, he wouldn't even give his kids his own product.
Right.
So that tells you something right there.
I mean, you hear that all the time, and a lot. I mean, I've read articles, and that
Hmm.
in Silicon Valley, the Waldorf schools and Montessori schools and everything are really popular, which are very low tech
Hmm.
schools because kids are they're probably wary of kids getting on those devices too.
Yeah, I just interviewed a Waldorf educator. I think I released it a couple weeks ago. Listeners can look for that, but it's fascinating the differences in the educational systems. And let's talk about that briefly. So, kids at public schools and a lot of private schools too are offering, kids are getting one-to-one devices in the classroom. So, children are using the devices for all different subjects and a lot of times taking them home, especially after, in my school, it's after fourth grade, starting in fourth grade. What are your thoughts about the current state of device use in our educational programs?
Yeah, I think it's excessive. I think that, as far as I know, there's never been a lot of really solid evidence that more computers in the classroom equates to better outcomes.
Right.
It's more expensive. It creates a dependence on technology where you have to keep upgrading it and everything.
Hmm.
But I think it's just something because of the allure of technology and these shiny devices that schools feel like, well,
Hmm.
of course we have to have those because that's going to be a big selling point for our schools. But one of the unfortunate things about COVID was pre-COVID there was parents they still weren't following the guidelines, but it was sort of like okay, I'm going to try to keep my kids off devices. They didn't have quite as much going on at school, but then COVID happened and everything's online. It's even for young kids, and they
Hmm.
got more into that remote classroom, the using technology more at all ages. And then
Hmm.
after COVID, we haven't gone back to the other way. It's sort of now we're still in that tech-centric, remote, sort of mindset.
Hmm.
And again, I worry most about younger kids, just that are, you know, haven't had the opportunity to really anchor in the real world and just learn how to
Hmm.
interact with other children and navigate risk and draw on a piece of paper and use their imaginations and read a whole book.
Hmm. Yeah, when we talk about attention span and focus, I interview a lot of teachers, and that's one of the number one complaints they have is kids cannot stay focused, especially if they're allowed to have their device on them. But even when they have it taken away, their focus and attention span is very limited.
Yeah, and it's just and there's also that fatigue factor, and where and I
Hmm.
wonder, you hear about this a little bit in the Gen Z, where there's a level of digital fatigue that's taking hold, where it's like
Hmm.
they're on these devices so much that eventually they're just worn out, and
Yeah, yeah,
you imagine a kid at school's on their computer, they bring it home, they still got it and everything, they just don't have a time to let their brain rest.
not good. Okay, and I'm working on a longer episode. I'm trying to aggregate all the data that does exist and how screens in school are being used, how it's not as effective, how the educational scores have dropped globally since the introduction of screens into the classroom, why they got introduced in the first place. It's just a really good marketing scheme for these companies to get little children hooked on these products. So
For sure.
it's a dupe.
It is, and one of the things that I wish would happen, and maybe legislation is the way, is to not have phones go into the schools like the
Hmm.
smartphones,
Hmm.
which and my daughter just graduated from high school, and she would take her phone into the classroom, and it creates, even though the teachers I think try to I don't know, police it, the kids are checking
Hmm.
their phones during class. It's this state of sort of continual partial attention where they're kind of paying
Yeah.
attention to the teacher and kind of checking their phone and kind of, and if they could have some way to check the phones at the door, and you hear from
Mm-hmm.
parents, well, what if I need to get in touch with them, or what if there's an
Mm-hmm.
emergency? What did we do
Yeah.
30 years ago? I mean, someone
Right.
they call the school office or whatever, and just
Yeah, and every classroom has a phone for the teacher to use. That you hit right on it is that we're all trying to get phone-free school movement going, but parents are the problem because parents do want to get a hold of their kids and they have a safety concern as well. If there's a shooting or something, they want to be able to know that their child is okay, which is a legitimate concern as well.
yeah, and yeah, unfortunately that has become a concern, and I wonder, and I'm not super expert on it, like
Yeah.
whether all the kids having a phone makes it any safer, even in that context, versus a teacher or a security or anything. But
Well, it does not.
it's
It
a
does not make them safer.
yeah,
I've talked to a few different experts about this, and imagine a dark room. There is a shooting going on. You turn the lights off, get under your desk, and then a shooter comes in the room and a kid has a phone light up or
right.
ding. Where is that shooter going to shoot at? So it literally makes them more unsafe, in my opinion. And I've talked to many different people about this. But it's the facade of safety that the phone gives. It's
Yeah,
not real safety.
I agree.
So
And it is, I mean, like, fortunately, a really unlikely event versus the very common event of kids just feeling stressed and distracted, and
right,
and
right.
how many of them then are committing suicide, and
Yeah,
that's a form of death as well. But anyway,
there you
that's
go. Yeah.
kind of morbid, but
No, it's the truth. I mean, my podcast is called Scrolling to Death, so this is where we can talk about that stuff
yeah.
because it is true. Okay, let's end with some tips. So, what tips do you give to parents who are looking to make positive changes around screens, maybe alternatives to digital media? What do you share with parents?
There's been a lot of emphasis in the past on amount of screen time, like less than 2 hours, 1 hour, whatever. I don't think that's
Hmm.
very, very effective just because it's become so difficult. There's that blurred line between, are they using it for school? Are they using it to contact grandma or whatever, and or
Hmm.
playing games? And now my focus really in terms of actionable things is on context. Like,
Hmm.
like set up some sort of situations where technology is just not a thing. And
Hmm.
I would recommend family meals. You see too often, families all together, but no one's really talking because everyone's checking their devices. In
Hmm.
the bedroom, if at all possible, especially for younger kids who need a good night's sleep, just have somewhere that they can go where they're away from their devices, and there are books in there, there's other
Hmm.
things in there. So that's a big one. Short car trips, just situations where there should be the child has the opportunity to get a little bit bored and to learn how to self-regulate, and because that's a
Yeah.
huge underrated developmental milestone for kids at all ages, is to learn to self-regulate
Hmm.
and to calm themselves down without a device, or not just get so bored and anxious they have to pull a device out all the time, even if they're
Hmm.
just standing for a short period of time. So the context
Yeah.
of use, content. So just
Hmm.
parents really doing their best to know what their child is using or watching.
Hmm.
And then for younger kids, there is some evidence that watching together or using together and talking about what you're doing is
Hmm.
can really mitigate a lot of the negative effects. Because
Yep.
if a parent and child are talking about their favorite movie or talking about their favorite book, they're talking, and so
Hmm.
so that's a good thing. And generally, when parents and children interact, that's sort of the secret sauce for good things happening.
When you talk about context, would you add like doctors' offices, grocery stores, restaurants?
Yeah,
Would
for
be a good
sure,
opportunity to not give the device.
absolutely. And at young ages, for sure, really avoiding at all costs handing over to a device to calm a child down, because
Hmm.
it does become very, I mean, it's hard to break that. When the child
Yeah.
is used to that being the pathway to soothing, let the child learn how to calm themselves down at a young age without having to depend on that, because it really can
Hmm.
become a big problem.
Yeah. I talked to another doctor recently and she said, it's okay. They can run around my office. They can scream. I expect it. They're children.
Yeah,
You
for
don't have to
sure.
calm them with the device. Right.
Absolutely. It's way, and I mean, that to me is way more normal than, I mean, I honestly get sad when I see a sort of a 4-year-old sitting there staring at their device when we're all talking about how they're doing,
Yeah.
and their health. So
And would you say, last question, is there, if you are giving your child device a lot in those situations, will there be like a wean off period where if you decide to try to restrict it, should we expect some pushback from the child?
For sure. It's kind of like quitting smoking or something. I mean, it's like there's going to be 3 days where things are pretty edgy. The child's going to be
Hmm.
like, I want my device back. Although I bet children will a day or so where they kind of are really fussy and then they'll kind of start to get themselves off. But yeah, I mean, that's completely normal to expect the child's going to, push back, maybe have some tantrums, maybe really start to fuss. And it's important just to stay calm and just set those boundaries and try to redirect them to something else. And that's the other recommendation I think that's maybe underemphasized is it's not always just restricting the technology. It's really encouraging things that aren't technology based, whether that's
Hmm.
taking care of a pet or watering plants or, going outside or just doing things that are more in the real world because those things still are fun. They're just not really as, paid attention to as they used to be.
Yeah, or just letting them figure something out. I think parents overschedule and overplan and feel like we have to set up things for our kids to do
Yeah.
when it'd be interesting to see, like, it is interesting to see what creative things they come up with when they are just left to their own devices, not actual devices, but
Right.
they're
I mean,
non-device devices.
boredom is the fertilizer for creativity. So it's like,
Mm,
you get bored and long enough, you're going to think of something to do. And that's been the case ever since children were children. So
okay. Yeah. So, Dr. Hutton, thank you so much for this time. This was super helpful for parents, and thank you for all the work you do to support families. We really appreciate you.
it's my pleasure.